My name is Kevin Berger, and I am the author of Atheism is Untenable. On this channel, I don't engage in apologetics. Instead, I apply the principles of polemics and skepticism to atheism and the claims made by atheists. This is justified nonetheless. Please like, share, subscribe, and turn on those notifications.
Hey, what's up, my tumbleweeds? It's widely known that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that this is, in fact, a textbook appeal to ignorance fallacy. Yet, for some reason, when theists accurately point out this fallacy to atheists, the canned response is often, the absence of evidence can be the evidence of absence if the presence of absence can reasonably be expected. Well, no. No, it's not, and I will explain why that is. By that logic, and I'm using the term loosely, Pluto didn't exist until 1930. Also, atoms didn't exist until they were discovered, germs didn't exist, and so on. There are countless instances where things existed prior to the point where we had evidence of them. There are countless instances of evidence being present before we recognized it as evidence, and there are countless examples of evidence being present and recognized and still not being acknowledged as such. I recall even as a child I was able to intuit correctly, just from the shapes of the continents, that the Americas were once connected to Africa and Europe, and I'm hardly unique in that respect. The notion that children might intuitively recognize the possibility of continental drift, particularly through observing how the continents appear to fit together, is a fascinating insight into how young minds interpret large-scale features of the Earth. Despite limited exposure to formal geoscience education, children frequently demonstrate remarkable spatial reasoning abilities, allowing them to detect patterns and imagine connections between shapes in ways that echo scientific developments. Many children display an intuitive understanding of the idea that continents might have once been connected. Studies in cognitive psychology highlight how children possess a remarkable ability for spatial reasoning and pattern recognition. Research by Newcombe and Huttenlocher, as detailed in Making Space, demonstrates that children interpret spatial relationships intuitively, even without formal instruction. Recognizing the shapes of the continents and speculating about their connections falls well within the scope of these skills. Children often perceive shapes and patterns in large-scale forms, sometimes in ways that align with scientific truths that adults and experts might overlook. This natural inclination for pattern recognition could help explain why many children notice the apparent fit of continents long before learning about continental drift. Now, of course, intuitions can be, and often are, mistaken, so we can hardly blame scientists for not accepting this at face value. Enter German meteorologist Alfred Wegener. In 1912, Wegener proposed the theory of continental drift, suggesting that the continents were once joined in a single landmass called Pangea that had since drifted apart. Wegener's idea wasn't just an intuition from the shapes of the continents either. His hypothesis was grounded in several pieces of evidence, including geological similarities across distant landmasses and fossil distributions that implied previous connections. Despite both its intuitive appeal and the body of evidence Wegener presented, his theory was largely dismissed by his contemporaries because he could not explain the mechanism behind the drifting. It was not until the mid-20th century, with the advent of plate tectonics, that the scientific community would finally accept Wegener's decades-old hypothesis. The resistance to Wegener's theory highlights a key theme in scientific discovery. Even ideas supported by observable evidence can face rejection if they clash with prevailing paradigms or the lack of full explanatory framework demanded by the scientific establishment. Part of the reason for this is the very notion that absence of evidence can be evidence of absence if the presence of evidence can be reasonably expected carries multiple built-in presumptions. When, where, and how the evidence might be detected, what form it should take, as well as the volume and quality of the evidence. Let's break down these presumptions further, as each layer reveals more of why this reasoning is often flawed. Number one, when the evidence should appear. There's an implicit assumption about the timing of evidence discovery. This assumes that if something exists, we would have observed it by now. But that disregards the possibility that evidence might emerge later, or that current observational limits, technological, spatial, temporal, simply haven't caught up. New methods or perspectives often reveal phenomena previously undetectable, as seen in fields like quantum physics and cosmology. 2. Where evidence should be found. There's an often unspoken agreement about where evidence ought to be found, but this can be highly context dependent. For instance, the lack of direct fossil evidence in certain regions doesn't imply that a species never existed, just that it hasn't been found there yet. Similarly, the search for extraterrestrial life often focuses on planets like Earth, with Earth-like conditions, but it's presumptions like these that assume life must exist in environments like our own that are unwarranted. Consider that if you go to the beach and scoop up a glass of water, to conclude from that single glass of water that there are no whales in the ocean is foolish. 3. How that evidence should manifest. This assumption dictates what kind of evidence we should expect to find, often shaped by our current theories and biases. However, if a phenomenon operates under unfamiliar principles, our expectations of its form or behavior might mislead us. For instance, expecting extraterrestrial life to have the same biochemical signatures like Earth life might exclude forms of life that don't conform to these criteria. Consider, for example, that all of our experience is restricted to carbon-based life. However, we cannot preclude some other life form, and indeed some have hypothesized silicon-based life forms. 4. What form the evidence should take. Closely related to the above, the presumption is that the type or quality of evidence, such that assuming that only certain kinds of evidence, observable data, count as real evidence. For example, indirect evidence like gravitational effects revealing planets can often be overlooked if we're focusing on direct observation alone. The insistence on particular forms of evidence often limits our capacity to recognize alternate yet valid forms. Consider that a more primitive life form could live elsewhere in the cosmos that has not yet developed the ability to transmit radio signals. If we expect to receive radio signals as the definitive evidence for extraterrestrial life, we are unjustifiably precluding the existence of such life. 5. The volume and quality of the evidence expected. This presumption leads to erroneous conclusions based on the quality. If we don't have enough evidence, we may assume non-existence. However, some phenomena are rare, fleeting, or subtle enough that accumulating substantial evidence takes time. High-quality evidence may be inherently sparse or difficult to obtain, as in dark matter research, where evidence relies on indirect effects and theoretical modeling rather than abundant observable data. Each of these presumptions limits our understanding and skews our conclusions, especially when dealing with unknowns. By assuming that evidence must meet certain criteria to confirm existence, we're at risk of overlooking valid data and reaching erroneous conclusions based on our expectations rather than on reality itself. In short, these expectations are all products of question-begging fallacies, and the conclusions drawn from their non-fulfillment are non sequitur. A better way to look at the topic follows. Consider the claim that a box contains a baseball. Premise 1. Matter cannot coexist in the same space. If matter is present within a given space, this precludes the presence of other matter. This is the principle of non-contradiction. Premise 2. A vacuum is devoid of matter, by definition. Conclusion. Therefore, the evidence of absence of an entity, E, in space S, is not the absence of evidence of E, but either 1, the presence of other matter, or B, the fact that the space is a vacuum. So, in this example, where the claim is that there is a baseball inside a box, the fact that the box is observed to not contain a baseball isn't the evidence that the baseball isn't there. The fact that the baseball's volume is already occupied, even with air, or that it is a vacuum is the evidence of the ball's absence. This logical framework suggests that it's not the absence of evidence that serves as the evidence of absence, even in this case. Rather, it is the presence of other matter, the presence of evidence, or the logically impossible fact of it being a vacuum, also the presence of evidence. Under this framework, the argument that the absence of evidence can be evidence of absence, should the presence of evidence be reasonably expected, can be discarded, thereby preserving the integrity of the principle that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, in avoiding potential fallacies like appeals to ignorance, special pleadings, and God of the gaps arguments. For example, if the perceived absence of evidence causes one to jump to conclusions that are unwarranted, though I suppose in this case the atheist could call this a nothing of the gaps. Now let's apply this to the claimed existence of, say, the Loch Ness Monster. The fact that we have no empirical evidence for the existence of Nessie to argue that this constitutes evidence for her non-existence is an example of fallacious reasoning. If, however, the loch were to be drained and no such entity were found, the fact that Loch Ness's volume was then observed to be occupied by other matter, even air, would serve as evidence of Nessie's non-existence. It's worth noting here that the reason the presence of matter doesn't work currently is because the water doesn't permit us to observe the contents of the entire loch's volume, meaning we cannot determine how much is water and how much is anything else. The same idea can be expanded on a universal scale. If one asserts universal non-existence of extraterrestrial life, the fact that we haven't encountered any and have no empirical evidence of any doesn't constitute evidence for universal non-existence, if for no other reason, because the entire universe isn't even observable. On a final note, it is also often argued that only positive claims require evidence. Firstly, no, what can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. There are no special rules for negative claims. And secondly, if you cannot demonstrate how you know something is true, then you cannot show that you know is true, and you're just arguing by assertion. In summary, even when the presence of evidence of E is reasonably expected, the perceived absence of evidence of E doesn't constitute evidence of the absence of E due to question begging and non sequitur fallacies, the reliance on inductive reasoning, and because the perceived absence of evidence could be attributable to limitations in our ability to detect or recognize it, or to a reluctance to acknowledge it as such. Therefore, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, remains an appeal to ignorance fallacy. Till next time, tumble on, my tumbleweeds.